Suddenly, suddenly we all appear. There's hundreds and hundreds of people currently watching us. I'm waiting on the message to say that we can officially start. I know Steve there, but welcome to the two pools. And I can see Steve. Steve, you're not next to Dippy today.
Well, I thought I'd give you the something a bit different, Paul.
Oh, isn't that fantastic?
All right.
Well, I tell you what, there's hundreds of people currently watching us, and they can get their first sight of the food store at M&S, and presumably that's where you go. Now I've got the green light. We've got permission to go. Welcome everyone to our latest webinar. We've got hundreds of people watching. We had over 200 people register for today's webinar, entitled "Emerging from the Lockdown: A Strategy for Economic Recovery." Want to follow the conversation on Twitter? You can. Hashtag this is Rochdale. I do need to. I've got a special public announcement to make. One of our entourage today, who's watching on the webinar, recently celebrated a landmark birthday. He's a friend of ours. He is the chief executive of Rochdale Football Club, David Bottomley. David, I know you can see me. It was a landmark birthday for David last week. He was 48. If, like me, you're surprised that he was 48, apparently he's knocked 20% off because of the furlough. So happy birthday to David. We're going to hear from Rochdale's three wise men today. We're going to hear from Paul Dixon, a partner of Molesworth, Bright and Clegg, followed by Steve Rumbelow, who is the chief exec of Rochdale Borough Council, and he virtually lived at the council's offices during the last 7 weeks of the lockdown, and ending with the acclaimed economist and the new chairman of Rochdale Development Agency, Steve Ormond. If you want to ask a question at any point, feel free to use the chat facility. I'm now going to ask Paul Dixon to summarise the government's 50-page announcements in 3 minutes. Paul, the clock starts now.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for that, Chris. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to This is Rochdale and Rochdale Ambassadors and our third lockdown webinar. Today is also the inaugural meeting of the RDIY HCS, which of course is the Rochdale Do-It-Yourself Haircutting Society. I like to think I'm a founder member. I know for sure that Chris Maguire is. And I don't know about you, Chris, but there's something that builds a unique bond with your children when you let them loose on you with those discount clippers they bought from the B&Q gardening section. But anyway, it's only 10 weeks till the barbers reopen and we can get all the damage repaired, can't we? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this very special webinar. Emerging from Lockdown, an Economic Strategy. We are, I'm sure, in for an enlightening conversation with Paul Ormrod in a few moments. I think it's important to stress that we are not looking at the micro issues today, and those are, when I say micro issues, I mean the steps that we as business proprietors, employers have to take to ensure that our staff are safe and following the government guidelines. I think it's important to stress also that on that issue, the law has not changed. The law is as it always was. We still have the same duty of care to our staff, to our colleagues, to our visitors, to our customers and to our suppliers and to anybody else that comes into contact with our business. The only thing that's changed is that we're dealing with a new threat to health and safety. And that threat, of course, is COVID-19. It's something we've not seen before. But those of you who've been in business for some time will be used to dealing with new threats as they emerge. It's probably, what, 30, 40 years, perhaps a little bit longer, since we had to deal with the realization that asbestos, which had previously been a miracle material, was actually a killer. And we had to make all sorts of changes and protect our staff. Over the years, we've had to deal with other issues as they've arisen in terms of health and safety, whether it's manual handling, repetitive strain injuries, and also environmental issues, our immediate environment, such as the problems now identified with external cladding on buildings and the fire resistance qualities of that. What I would say to you is go to the government guidance. The documents are actually quite easy to read. 50 pages might be daunting. The latest guidance issued, I think, yesterday, that deals with the issues as they relate to 8 different sectors. It's quite easy to get through. There's good guidance on the HSC website. And there are, of course, a number of extremely good health and safety consultancy businesses in and around Rochdale. Do engage with them. You'll get good quality, common sense advice from them, and they will guide you through it. However, today's webinar is about the economic strategy from emerging from lockdown. It's significant that this webinar was planned and arranged 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, when the situation felt different, we didn't know when we were coming out of lockdown, we didn't know what the Prime Minister was going to announce when it got to review date. We've now had the announcement, he's set out his plan, and we are here today looking at a strategy for emerging from it. That we are doing this, that we have the confidence to do this, is a tribute to the Rochdale businesses, the way they have supported one another throughout the last couple of months, the way they've engaged with one another, and the way that they have also engaged with those who've needed our help. I was looking at some web media reports the other day. I've identified 30 or 40 Rochdale businesses just from media reports that have stepped up to the plate to provide goods and services for the NHS, whether it's manufacturing components for ventilators, furniture for the Nightingale hospitals, providing large quantities of sanitising gels. And also those businesses, many businesses who've answered the call from our local hospice and care homes who've needed PPE equipment urgently. The response from Rochdale businesses has been fantastic, and I think demonstrates the camaraderie, the cooperation and the support that exists within the borough. I'd also like to make special mention of Rochdale Council, our local authority, and all its divisions, including in particular the RDA. The RDA have kept businesses together, they've kept us updated. The daily updates on the Business Matters emails have been superb. They've been on point, succinct, they've connected businesses, and we know that RDA have reached out to businesses across the borough and supported them during the last couple of months. But it's not just the RDA. The council more broadly has reached out to the community. I know that within the first week they identified tens of thousands of residents who were deemed to be at risk or in need of support. They've reached out to them, they've ensured that food has been delivered at the same time, and medicines, and at the same time as ensuring that all the other essential services have continued to function as normally as possible. And they've also taken a very sensible decision to get on with the road improvement scheme while the traffic's quiet, the roads are quiet, and you can make good progress on that. Steve, I'd like to say to you as a chief exec, thank you to you. Thank you to all your various departments, your divisions, your operational staff, your executive officers. And I think also thanks very much indeed to your elected members, from the council leader to all the other councillors who really have stepped up to the plate and shown that they really do care about the borough, its businesses and its people. So Steve, thank you to everybody. And if I've not embarrassed you enough already, it's time for me to hand over to you now, sir.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you for that as well. I've learned something from Paul's first remarks, actually. I thought we were following the Matt Lucas plan to get out of lockdown, but obviously not. I mean, he's more Churchillian than the Prime Minister is and has got just as much clarity, but we'll leave that to one side for now. I mean, you're right, Paul. The council's political leadership, supported by the senior officer group that I lead, is very much committed, as it always was, to growth of the borough. And I think that's what this morning is really focusing on. We have, of course, had to put a lot of effort into supporting the most vulnerable people in our communities. This is unprecedented amount of social disruption, and the council quite rightly has had to focus a lot of time and attention on that. But we're also focused on the things that we can do to create the conditions and to help you, the businesses of Rochdale, to drive recovery and growth. And I think that's what we really want to focus on today. On that, of course, what we've tried to do is also focus on some business as usual that will help to create some of those platforms. Rochdale Riverside 1, that some people may have just seen, we've got a drummer in the background, is now finished. we've only got Marks and Spencer Food Hall open, but interesting, we are still having inquiries about some of the vacant units, and I think that's very positive. Rochdale Riverside 2, the site cabins have now gone from that site. Enabling works will start next month, and we'll be moving towards creating the site for development and working towards getting the planning application as well. Same goes for Central Retail Park. That's the first site of the station gateway. We're still working on getting a planning application in before the end of the year on that. Another station gateway project is the fire station. That's stalled for a short period, for about 4 or 5 weeks, while the contractor rebooted supply chains, but cases are now back on site with that. We're also going to get a £700,000 ERDF grant, which will mean that we can finish the whole job. So we'll be able to do the museum part on the ground floor, but importantly, we'll also be able to finish the co-working space above it. The Town Hall project that people will be aware of, we've still got that on track. The final submission for HLF funding goes in at the end of this month, and we're still on target to start that project, a £16 million investment early in 2021. I just wanted also to mention Junction 19 Link Road. That's another project that we've managed to keep on track. We've now got the tenders in, it's come in within budget, so we will be moving that project forward, and that of course will create a link road through to Hayward Distribution Park, opening up space for 1,000 homes and employment space as well. I mean, today's focus is very much about getting our economy back on its feet, and that actually has to happen now. We talked 2 weeks ago about how we needed to prepare ourselves for a new kind of workspace, somewhere that was lower density, working socially distanced, but getting back to full production. I think it's also probably worth reminding ourselves that most businesses were not instructed to close, and many Rochdale businesses are still operating, and this is about ramping back up to something near a full production as quickly as possible, but of course as safely as possible. There is now a lot of advice around, but it is very much about businesses themselves converting that advice and making it work in their particular workspaces. And as Paul's very eloquently said, none of the stuff around your responsibilities, the company's responsibilities to their workforce has changed. It's just being driven by a different threat. And I want to reassure businesses that our position as a council is first and foremost to support businesses to get fully operational again. And although we do have a regulatory role, that will only be brought into play, the enforcement will only be brought into play if businesses are not cooperating and demonstrably not supporting their staff back into work in a safe working environment. We talked a couple of weeks ago about the 5 tests that the government has put in place to get us to this point, and that was making sure the NHS could cope, a consistent and sustained fall in death rates, reliable data on infection rates, and that's the famous reproduction rate, the R number. And through all this, it's really important that we do focus on keeping that infection rate, that reproduction rate down below that magic 1. So that is something that we all need to take responsibility for as well in how we manage our workforce back to full production. And the other 2 tests, of course, one was about testing and PPE. If I'm honest, I don't think the government are anywhere close to where they need to be to speed up into the next phase of the release. But although I do think there's enough headroom in the NHS to cope with a low second spike. But it's really important also to recognise that the government tests at the moment do not apply with any geographical intelligence. So it is not possible with any certainty to get that R number for the Northwest. And the indicators seem to be that we are running somewhat behind London and the southeast, and that's something I think that we're going to have to be very careful with and look at very carefully going forward. It is the right thing to do. We've got to start to move the economy forward now, but we've got to do it with a close eye on that R number and how that R number applies more locally, not necessarily across the country, because the average does get reduced by areas like London that are further forward in terms of the peak, and areas that have not been impacted as badly as some of the more urbanised areas. I'm going to leave it at that now. I think the interview with Paul should be really enlightening, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to that. So thanks very much. Back to you, Chris.
Yeah, thanks very much, Steve, as well. And thanks very much to Paul Dixon, whose haircut is a lot better than mine, it's fair to say, which is the reason he probably brought it up. But my hair always looks the same. So welcome to Paul Ormrod. Paul, I'm at a loss as to how to describe you, only because there's so many descriptions. Esteemed economist, author, visiting professor at UCL, entrepreneur, influential advisor, and the new chairman of the Rochdale Development Agency. Welcome to you. If it's okay, I'm going to start with your Rochdale connections as well, because you really are Rochdale born and bred. Tell us a bit about your childhood, Paul, because you were born in Rochdale, and I think you lived in a one up, one down.
We did indeed. In Platting Lane in Balderstone, it's been pulled down for many, many years. And then when I was about 4 or 5, I think I was 4, we moved to Cuckold, where I grew up. You know, so I'm steeped in Rochdale as a child.
Yeah, and you can tell you're an esteemed economist because you've got all the books in the background, whereas in my case, I've just got some.
Oh, you don't know what's in them, do you? You don't know what's in these.
No, we don't.
Might just be cartoons.
Now, at 18, you went to Cambridge University. You did a postgraduate at Oxford University. I followed a very similar path myself, actually. I drove through both towns. Did you know you wanted to be an economist at that stage in your life?
Well, I think because I didn't do economics at A level, but I thought it might be interesting to do economics. So that's what I did at Cambridge. And of course, at that stage, you don't really know what you want to do when you're doing your first. Well, some people do, but I certainly didn't. And I must admit, looking back, I think part of the reason I wanted to do a postgraduate degree was because it was 2 years. Was it avoided getting a job? So that was so you can carry on being a student for a bit longer. But it was then that's a bit more committing. You know, you are saying, you know, you have a career in mind which might involve economics, and that's indeed what I ended up doing. But it was only at that stage rather than any earlier.
Well, if I had a red book, I'd hand it to you now, because this is going to sound a bit like This Is Your Life, except I'm hosting it, which isn't as good. You went on to lead the economics assessment unit at The Economist. Then you launched a successful economic forecasting company, and then you wrote the US Business Book of the Year in 2006. Are there any highlights we should mention that I've missed in that brief potted history of your life?
Well, I think one thing to note is that I've been president of Hornets for over 10 years now, so that's an important highlight. But I think the first book that I wrote was in the 1990s. And it was essentially a critique of a theoretical and empirical critique of the free market economics, which were rather dominant then. And I wanted to give it rather an obscure title. I wanted to call it a theoretical critique of general equilibrium. But the publishers decided to call it The Death of Economics, which I think was a much better move. And it sold over 1 million copies worldwide. So that was very gratifying.
Wow. Well, we're going to talk about your views on the lockdown shortly as well. But I've just got a couple of other questions to ask you, which are relevant to Rochdale. You've travelled the world. You know, I mentioned earlier that you're an esteemed author. Your dad still lives in Rochdale. You recently accepted the position of chairman at Rochdale Development Agency. What do you hope to bring to the role?
Well, I think, first of all, can I say, you know, pay tribute to my predecessors. I think the agency has done a lot of very good work in supporting businesses and generating jobs in the town. And I think we've also got a very strong board, in my view, with a wide range of skills and experience. And so what I'd be hoping to bring will perhaps be, perhaps a bit of a wider perspective, to step back and look at some strategic issues. I know we're going to be talking about these things later, but perhaps just give a couple of examples. I should say these are not definitive policy yet. These are just a couple of ideas. So one of the ways economists look at places or companies or whatever is to say, have they got comparative advantages? And what we're meaning there is, compared to other places which might attract investment, what does Rochdale have? This is by no means an exhaustive list. This is just an illustration. Perhaps a couple of points is, one of our advantages is that we're very close to the centre of Manchester. And as we know, in the last 20, 25 years, central Manchester has grown absolutely dramatically, created many, many jobs, and people who'll remember it even in the late 1990s. It was virtually, even if you'd wanted to, you couldn't live in the centre of Manchester because there were no private houses. And now it's been completely transformed. And we're very close to central Manchester. And so a strategy, and it's already being pursued, for example, Steve mentioned the Station Gateway. A strategy is to try to provide the kind of housing which people who work in central Manchester would find attractive, but which of course is much cheaper than it is in the South Manchester area. Very much cheaper. You can get the same quality and size of a house for well under half the price. I think provision of high quality residential accommodation is itself an industrial strategy, because we want people who are working in central Manchester to live here and bring their money back with them. And then they'll be spending it and creating opportunities for a whole load of businesses in the town. And we're not really, I think, my perception is a number of the other Greater Manchester boroughs, in a sense, still trying to compete with Manchester and say, well, their jobs should come to us. Well, opportunistically, we should do that. But strategically, we think, no, let's get people in Manchester living here and bringing their money back here. And that's an important point. I think just as an aside on that, I do know this is a concern at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority level, and it's a general concern about cities. We see a lot of speculation that, with the COVID, that cities will, people want to move out and they won't be as successful as they have been. I think just a couple of points quickly on that. I think, first of all, a vaccine, or certainly more likely some form of treatment, will be a game changer, and then the growth of cities will resume. But I think if we take a very broad perspective, and if we look at the growth of London, say, and other major world cities over many, many centuries, they had frequent outbreaks of plague, which killed on a much bigger scale. Obviously, the Black Death was the main one, but there were many, many others. There were frequent occurrences. And these would typically kill 5 and 10% of the population, 3-6 million people, and today's. But the attractions of cities were so great, people found ways of working with them. So I think cities will still be an important attractor, and we should take advantage of that.
Well, can I ask you a question? Can I ask you a question, if I may? You mentioned earlier about, and I think you're spot on actually, in terms of the importance of getting a good travel connections between Rochdale and Manchester. That's going to be pivotal, because that will bring people to want to live in Rochdale but work in Manchester as well. In terms of opportunities, and you used this word a lot when we spoke last week, you say Rochdale's got a massive opportunity, whether that's advanced manufacturing, but the key word you use is innovator. And if companies take that approach, they use innovation, you think they can actually, recover, thrive and survive coming out of COVID-19 and the lockdown?
Well, I'd say it's not just, I think it's absolutely essential. It's more important than ever because crises do change things. there's often, as I've been saying, there's often more continuity when you look back than people appreciate when the crisis is taking place. But crises do offer opportunities, but you have to innovate, because we can't just turn the clock back and restart from where we were in February. We have to innovate. I mean, just 2 points here. I think, first of all, Rochdale's got a strong manufacturing tradition. And some of these examples have already been mentioned this morning of how the companies have responded to this. But I think one thing is pretty certain going forward is that, if you like, international supply chains, and particularly those connected to China, are going to be a lot shorter. There's going to be a lot more domestic sourcing over the next few years. And I think this represents a great opportunity for a borough, which has a strong manufacturing tradition and is willing to innovate. And I know there are some very advanced technology companies in the borough. So I think it's a great opportunity for the manufacturing sector. But if I could just switch tack slightly and go back to the previous question, I think it's again an opportunity which has been created. And this is at the moment a bit more amorphous. It's hard to put firm guidelines in place. And this may come as a surprise to people, but I think we've got a great opportunity to develop an upmarket tourist industry. Because even before the crisis, if you like, what I would call purpose holidays, which in nice hotels, nice restaurants, but with some sort of purpose, whether it's an activity or whether it's educational, they've been growing rapidly. And the borough's got a huge amount to offer in terms of our heritage. So we have to remember that this is one of the places where the modern world started. When the Industrial Revolution started, which changed the world profoundly, the most profound change in the history of the world, it started here, and we should be taking advantage of that. We've got the worldwide co-op movement with tens of millions and large followings of the principles across the world. And it started here, and we're not really taking enough advantage of that. We've got our magnificent town hall. Rochdalians are accustomed to it, but I was fortunate to be given a very detailed guided tour a few years ago. And it's a complete eye-opener to the details and how it was built. And it was built, when Rochdale was one of the richest towns in the entire world. It was a display of municipal pride and wealth. And I think it's one of the iconic buildings of England, and we should be making more of that. And finally, just as a final point of this, think of our countryside. Now, people who come without cultural preconceptions are really quite bowled over by it. For over the top period, I've had quite a number of foreigners staying with me in the borough, and I don't mean people from Yorkshire here. You've got to draw the line somewhere. But they come without any cultural preconceptions, and they find it absolutely stunning. So there's a lot going there. Now, it's one thing to think that, and it's another thing to translate it. But I'm hoping that in conjunction with businesses over the next few years, the ODA can evolve a strategy to actually try and realise something like this. So it's an opportunity because, again, foreign holidays are being cut back. There'll be more domestic holidays. So it's a big opportunity for us.
We've been sent some questions already, but I'm going to save those to the end. So I've got a lot of questions to rattle through. Something you just mentioned earlier. You think we'll be less reliant on China when we moving forward? Do you?
Well, yes, I think that's a consensus which is coming out, that this is being driven by America, and also, I mean, even Australia, where I was for a month in February. They've had much closer links, but already, they're cutting those back quite sharply. And I think that's certainly something which is going to be a fixture over the next few years.
Yeah, I was listening yesterday to the fact that there's a bit of a diplomatic spat between Australia and China at the moment because Australia want an independent inquiry into what happened at the very start of COVID-19. Question I want to ask is that you think the success of businesses in recovering from the pandemic will be how we change behaviour, don't you? How our workers, our workforces change behaviour.
Well, I think it's rather more than that, because we see all these projections about the number of infections and how there might be a second wave. But what got me interested in this is if you actually look at the models which epidemiologists use. And now, I mean, to a layperson, they'd look, the mathematics would be very intimidating, but for economists, it's really quite straightforward to follow. But they are dependent on assumptions about behavior. And this is really the key. And if we think about this, we can see how the government strategy is motivated. So there are two key things, one of which is to say, if you haven't got the disease and you meet somebody with it, what's the probability that you catch that disease in a single encounter? Now, obviously, that's going to vary tremendously depending on the nature of the encounter. If you're running on the canal towpath and you pass another jogger, even if you're less than a metre apart, your chances of catching it are essentially zero. But if you're in a confined room with the same person for an hour, it's more. So we can see that already you can see the motivation for strategy there. But the simple expedient, say, of wearing a covering over the mouth and nose, some sort of mask, doesn't have to be a surgical one. Seems to me that's very important that countries like South Korea and less well known, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, adopted that from the outset. And they had much lower infection rates because the way it spreads is through droplets. And the point of wearing a mask, except if you're obviously a health worker or a bus driver or something, is not so much to protect you, it's to protect other people from you. If you've got the disease, if you cough or sneeze, your droplets are more contained. So that's one aspect, and it appears in the mathematics. And the other is just simply a key assumption is how much social interaction, how much social mingling there is. And so providing that people, are sensible about behavior going forward and don't try and revert to what it was in February, I think, we should be able to gradually come out of this, really quite strongly. But it's critically dependent upon how sensibly people behave.
At the last Ambassadors event, Paul Stobart, the CEO of Zen Internet, fantastic company, employs nearly 600 people, 500 in Rochdale. He made the point that post-lockdown, as we go back to work, because most people are working from home at Zen Internet, he thinks they'll only be able to accommodate 40% of staff at any one time. And they'll be very cute in terms of, the way they bring staff back and the way they work from home. Do you think the genie's out of the bottle in terms of home working now?
The reason I'm slightly hesitant is that I remember in the late 1980s when personal computers took off. So for the first time, you could actually have, you could do analysis, you could write reports at home. And also, fax machines. Then you could convey information. People under 30 don't know what one of those is now, but it was a way of sending information remotely. And there was a lot of people then saying, "Oh, this will, create home working," and that never happened because people like to go into offices. And I think we do have to take a slightly longer term view. The things are always changing, and it might cause some people to say, yes, we prefer working from home, and that might lead to a sort of permanent change. But again, I think we've got to take a longer perspective and say, well, at some point, a decent treatment will be found. We will gradually get back to normal. I'm not saying it will be this year. So we mustn't be too pessimistic about that. But people have adapted, and as I was saying earlier, Paul Dixon was saying, businesses have adapted to all sorts of things in the past and still keep going. And yet the way businesses operate now, even before the crisis, would be very recognizable to somebody 50 years ago. I mean, obviously there are changes, obviously there are differences, but going back to this theme, there's also, I think it's hard to appreciate during a crisis, you know, a lot of continuity.
I'm just looking at the BBC, the latest news on the BBC, and the economy for the first 3 months of this year shrunk by 2%, which is the biggest drop since the financial crisis of 2008. No surprise there, but that only includes 1 week of the lockdown. Obviously, the movement today is the return to work. Do you think, I mean, we obviously have to return to work. We've got the furlough system, which I'm going to ask you about in a second, which has been extended until October. Is the question now, as we return to work, what constitutes an acceptable risk? Is that the way employers and employees need to view it?
Well, I think we need to view it as a society that way. And in fact, we're much more accustomed to this than people realise. See, for example, if we take road traffic accidents, now there are nearly 2,000 deaths a year on the roads, and there are getting on for 250,000 injuries through road accidents. Quite a lot of them, 25,000 or so, are actually serious. Now, we could abolish those by abolishing road traffic completely. But we don't do that because of the benefits which having cars and vans and lorries brings to us. What we try and do is mitigate or reduce the chances of an injury or death. And on that, different governments over the period of decades have been very successful. That 50 years ago, even though there was much less traffic, road deaths were 4 times as high as they are now. So with road safety, education, and a sense again of personal responsibility, we've managed to cope with that. So there is what economists said, there's a trade-off. There's a cost of having road traffic, and we trade it off for the benefits that it brings. And we really have to look at this in the same sort of way. You know, yes, the virus is there, and as long as it's there, there will be some risk. We try and mitigate that as far as possible with the safety measures and taking personal responsibility, as I say, wearing masks in enclosed spaces. And that will be a way of mitigating it. But there is no risk-free or cost-free way out of this crisis.
You came up with a traffic light system in terms of a 3-part plan in terms of how to get out of the lockdown. To be fair, I mean, you say it yourself, we were probably already in the red phase even before Boris's announcement on Sunday night. In terms of moving forward, where do you see us in terms of the amber and the green? And can things return to normal, or will they just return to a new normal?
Well, actually, just on that, one of the things, because I wrote that with an economist called Gerard Lyons. He's a prominent city economist, and many years ago, I supervised his PhD, so we've known each other. But more to the point, he was Boris Johnson's chief economist when he was mayor of London, so he has, if not access to the government machine. And we wrote this document in early April, and it did have, it's not just me saying this, it's been acknowledged in the press quite widely, quite a substantial impact in shaping strategy. And in fact, go back to the previous question, one of the things I'm proud about was, I think this is about 20th of April, the whole front page of The Sun was devoted to traffic light exit from lockdown, but the banner said, devised by scientists. I thought, fantastic, you know, I'm a real scientist at last, you know. But yeah, so essentially we are in the red phase where there's a gradual opening. What we were saying should be driven on an economic basis, because there have been lots of arguments saying it should be driven, say, on age, which we rejected and say you've got to open up sectors according to their risk. And as Steve said, many businesses needn't have closed down and they're now reopening. So we're essentially in the red phase. And I would have preferred, I mean, they've gone for a more complicated 5-colour system because, I mean, that's what the Americans had after 9/11. There was a security threat indicator. I think a traffic light one would have been simpler and easier to understand. But you just gradually unlock it. It's sending a signal, a psychological message to people about the state of play. And obviously what we wrote down in early April has to be revised. So for example, even then we did say that mass gatherings should be, the last things to be relaxed, because these are, if you like, hotbeds of the way the disease spreads. And we said that right from the outset, even though now that's become commonplace. So I think it does mean, in terms of the timetable we suggested well over a month ago, that things like, major football games, won't be viewed by spectators for some considerable time, and probably not until there's some sort of effective treatment. So you gradually unlock on the basis of, the risks involved. And as the number of new infections goes down, as the number of deaths goes down, you can gradually take a slightly more risk, always providing that people behave sensibly.
In terms of, and it's very hard for an economist or even a scientist to come up with, to guess timescales. But can you put a timescale on it? For example, when do you think we might see, mass gatherings at Man United? For example, which will probably be the benchmark of when we're through the worst of it and we're coming out the other side. When do you think, in terms of a timescale, is it this year? Are we looking next year, or is it just impossible to guess?
Well, I realise that it's very important to people. Now, whether you'd count crowds at the Dale and Hornets as mass gatherings, I'm not quite sure. I mean, certainly Hornets could probably open earlier than the Dale, so we might be playing earlier than Manchester United. But I said the mass gatherings are really the last things to be relaxed. And I think it's absolutely, people, just an aside on this, absolutely incredibly, I think the government's been badly served by some of the scientific advice it's received. So in March, the government's chief scientist, Sir Patrick Vallance, incredibly said that he didn't think mass gatherings were of much consequence in spreading the virus, absolutely incredibly. And as a result, Cheltenham races went ahead, Atletico Madrid went to Liverpool. There are a number of major spreading events took place as a result of that. So they're unusual. And I think, to be honest on that, before they can play to capacity, I do think there will have to be, if not a vaccine, some form of effective treatment before we can go back to that. But they're unusual. Now, you asked me a question on the time frame. Well, I would say I think it will be perfectly plausible by the autumn for most of the economy to be running at more or less normal capacity. That will depend also on behaviour, and it will partly depend on confidence, how confident people feel. But the more the infections go down, the more the death rate goes down, the more confident people will feel.
I watched a video of what South Korea does, and their tracking system is amazing. It's interesting, actually, that they opened up their nightlife at the weekend, and there's been a cluster of over 100, which they think has come from one person in the nightlife in South Korea. Moving forward as a economy and as a country, how important do you think the 3 T's will be? Testing, tracking, and treatment.
Well, I mean, I've mentioned treatment. I mean, just on that, there's drugs often, most drugs fail. There's a major study at MIT a couple of years ago looking at nearly 500,000 drugs of all sorts, which went through formal testing. And, about 85%, fail, but but there will be something which comes out. There's a lot of effort going into it. But again, testing and tracking was abandoned incredibly. We don't know exactly why, what advice was given. But I don't believe it's something the politicians would have done of their own accord. They obviously received some scientific advice to abandon this.
That was the 12th of March, wasn't it? That was the thing. They abandoned testing in care homes.
The full story on that has yet to emerge, but that was clearly, and people said at the time, it wasn't with the benefit of hindsight, that was a major mistake. But testing and tracking does give people confidence. It helps to contain. I think Steve rather hinted at this, that one of the problems will be not a national second wave, but localized ones. And it's these localized ones which testing and tracking do enable much more effectively to control. But you mentioned South Korea. Now, at the moment, people are still pretty shell-shocked by this virus. It's the first one nobody Well, even my dad, who's 97, didn't live through the Spanish flu. He just about missed it. I suppose if he'd been born a few years earlier, he might have died of it. But we're not used to it, so we're shell shocked by it. We can't really see. But there will be, ways of adapting. And we look at, say, the Asian countries. Now, they've had much more recent experience of very serious. I mean, SARS itself was much more deadly than COVID. And they learned from their experience. Like the South Koreans developed testing and tracking. Actually, a country which not really mentioned, I think Vietnam has had virtually no cases. They've all learned on how to cope from this. Going back to the point about cities, Hong Kong's incredibly dense, but they've learned. And so I do feel there's an undue pessimism around about thinking like, will there be a second wave in the winter? And this really comes from natural scientists who don't realize how people can adapt and can learn and set up processes which enable us to cope with a second pandemic much, much more effectively than we've done the first. And that's a clear lesson from South Asia. We might have got, any government would have got things wrong this time around, no matter who it had been. They might have made different mistakes, a different government, but they would have made mistakes. The key test will be when the next one comes, that we've learned from it and we handle it much more effectively.
I'm going to ask you a question about furlough, but I'm going to combine it with a couple of questions that we've been sent in from, I've got 188 people watch this webinar at one point. Chris Casey of Casey Construction talks about the furlough scheme. Given the huge cost of the furlough scheme, what will be the impact on government spend in the near future? But I'm going to combine that with another question. What do you think businesses need to do to prepare for the ending of the furlough scheme? Because that's costing a huge amount of money. So Chris asked, given the huge cost of the furlough scheme, what will be the impact on the government spend in the future? But also my question is, what do you think businesses need to do in terms of preparing for the end of the furlough scheme?
Well, you might have to remind me of your question because these are fundamental issues. I mean, the Chancellor's got a very difficult problem in that in the short term, it's clear that in a sense, the government can support this expenditure. And it does it by the Bank of England both issuing debt and, quite literally printing money. But obviously, there's got to be some sort of end to that process at some point. It really can't go on forever. And I think, the Chancellor seems to have judged things rather nicely. I think he's rather hoping that by October or in September, he won't be paying much out on furlough. But a lot will depend upon, say, going back to the confidence point. I think the last time that the public finances were in this state was at the end of World War II. And what happened then, there were two things, one of which is the government did impose, quite severe austerity. That there were tax increases and restraints on public spending for a number of years. And then gradually, and this is a more technical point, but it's an important one, is when the government issues debt, it's issued in nominal terms. A government bond, the value is £100, and that's fixed. And so if you hold it to maturity, if you did, you get £100 back. But in the meantime, if there's any inflation, if you like, the effective value of that has fallen. And that's how governments managed in the 50s and 60s to get it down, but partly by controls on spending and tax, but partly by having some inflation which eroded the real value of the debt. Like people with a mortgage took a mortgage out 20 years ago. It's not as hard to pay it back now as it was then because its real value has fallen. But yes, there are bound to be some restraints, and I think there are bound to be some tax increases. And I would rather be inclined to bring in tax increases rather than further squeezes on spending, especially if, and we've not really touched on this, the government's still keen on pursuing its levelling up agenda as far as the regions are concerned, that the public spending there can act as a catalyst for sparking off the private sector. So I'm hoping that they'll switch to, there'll be more emphasis on tax increases, but that's certainly something that people ought to expect to happen.
We'll talk about.
Go back to ask me your question again, sir.
I'm mindful we've got a lot of questions to get through, but we'll talk about the regions and the devolution in the 5th hour today, Paul. Chris Casey also asked, given the comments on the Bank of England and potential downturn, how should businesses be preparing for that?
Well, it's very difficult, isn't it? In terms of, my own view is that actually many economic recessions there's a lot of psychology involved. That's why they're so hard to anticipate and so hard to predict what will happen. There seems to be a crucial point looking back at previous major recessions. Once confidence starts to return, things look very bleak. They look very bleak, they look very bleak. But then once confidence starts to return, it can come back very quickly indeed. It can, and so, things can come back sharply, once that particular, once people feel more confident. I think the risk, we are facing risks at the moment that even if people go back to work, will they spend, or will they simply stay at home? What will be bought? So there are some risks that it's already a very, very severe depression, probably the worst that has been since the Bank of England started to keep records on it 300 years ago. And so, it does, there are huge job losses, people's incomes are falling already. But once confidence returns, I think it will come back really quite sharply. And I think, if you like, the medical indicators, once people feel confident, infections are under control, death rates are really down, it's that'll give people the confidence to go back to work, rather than government pronouncements.
Been asked a question by Mark Whitaker. He says, great webinar. Do you think air travel will be permitted this summer or even this year?
Well, I think we can fly to France still, but I think that's, or Ireland. We can go to Ireland. We can go to Ireland. Well, obviously that again, precisely because two things. One, on the plane itself, you're in a confined space with other people for a long period of time, and so, if you like, that's a mass gathering, and so we can see why that's right at the end of the queue. And understandably, people are, one thing I think, big mistake of the government, I can't understand why we didn't, I said so at the time, again, it's not with hindsight, why we didn't close our borders much earlier. Countries which have managed it very successfully, like Australia and New Zealand, did close their borders completely, but more or less completely, very early on. And this prevents, if you like, it being imported back in once you've got it under control domestically. So I think because of that, restrictions on air travel are bound to persist, even when the virus seems to be under control in this country, or in Germany, or in France, or Italy, or whatever. You're bound to keep quite strict restrictions on international travel because you don't want to risk re-importing it. Then gradually they'll bring in effective testing and that and so forth at airports, and people will feel more relaxed. But I would say really next year before it really starts to take off.
A question from George Brigham, runs a great business, took part in a roundtable we did recently. How does Paul think China might react to the potential downturn in their economy caused by other nations sourcing products nearer to home?
Well, they're not standing still. I mean, the Chinese have, if you like, been buying influence and a geopolitical strategy for a long time now. That they've been, many African countries now are essentially, client states of the Chinese. But they also do face, I mentioned Vietnam earlier, but it's countries like Vietnam who see this as a major opportunity. So they'll be facing not just perhaps the relative lack of availability of Western markets, but countries who don't have China's negative image as a result of the virus, or at similar levels of technology, see a chance to move in. So I do think that they will have substantial problems. And we mustn't forget that although they've been very successful in China, they're still a long way behind the West in terms of living standards. There is still a big gap. And I've never been completely convinced, even before the crisis, that they will be able to bridge that gap. It's a massive step to take. It's one thing to get to a certain level of economic development, then the next one, which takes it to Western levels, is really quite hard. So I think it will be that they'll experience really quite difficult times.
You're earning your money today, which you're not actually getting. But another question, I think it's pronounced Lisa. It's spelled Lesa, Hannigan. Do you anticipate that the planning and execution of Brexit, who would have believed it would have taken 56 minutes to have mentioned Brexit, but do you anticipate that the planning and execution of Brexit activities will complicate or impact the COVID recovery? If so, how?
Well, I think the Brexit talks are still going on, and quite right. There's no reason they shouldn't be. Well, if you look at it in perspective, so obviously this was an issue which has dominated British politics for not just recently, but for years. And we can see, it's relatively minor compared to what we're experiencing with a pandemic. And I'd always thought that. In fact, I did, going back to Gerard Lyons, the economist I mentioned, we did a piece together which was published when Boris Johnson was the mayor. And essentially we argued then that the key thing going forward wasn't so much whether Britain left or joined the EU, but it was how much we innovated, how much the EU innovated. And one of the problems I think with many European countries is that the EU, is acting as a barrier to innovation. So I think it's relatively second order compared to the impact of the virus. And I don't really see that there's no real reason why the talk should be halted and we shouldn't continue with the process.
Another question we've been sent through, and I think I've got time for a couple of more. So keep your questions or keep your answers nice and brief, Paul. How do we keep our workforces fully engaged when we follow the government advice to return to work and put our people at additional risk, when quite clearly the policymakers are not putting themselves at the same risk? Difficult question that, but it's been raised.
I think one thing that's not been emphasised is that, and this, if we step back, I can't give a short answer to this one because they're all important questions. If we go back to the middle of March, we had very, very limited data. We had some data coming out of China suggesting that the death rate might be between 3 and 5%. We saw the total chaos in the northern Italy, which fortunately the NHS has managed to avoid completely. So we could see why people then panicked. The data that's come out subsequently shows very clearly that at least 95% or more of all deaths are from people with underlying medical conditions. And the evidence is showing very clearly that basically if you haven't got an underlying medical condition, the risks you face of death are very, very low indeed, especially, young people face virtually zero risk. So this is a message which is not, it's a very difficult one for a government to convey, but this is a one which isn't coming through and I think should be emphasised more strongly.
I'm going to ask a final question actually, and I should just mention we've been sent a couple of questions from Geraldine Connor and Beverly Harmston as well, but they're more council questions really, Paul. I don't think they'd be right to ask you those questions. If you got the call today from Boris and said, Paul, we've seen your performance on Rochdale Development Agency's webinar today, and we think you're what we need at these daily briefings, and you were advising them, and I would like to broker a deal on that if you want me to, Paul. What would you be advising the government to do right now? What would your advice be to them moving forward as we go out of the lockdown?
Well, I think I come back to this point is a key factor in all of this is confidence. And I think this is what's holding people back. It's well established that people dislike uncertainty. in the sense that uncertainty in the sense is that, it's one thing, for example, to play the national lottery. I mean, people know they've virtually no chance of winning. So that's not uncertainty. They know that. They play that in the full knowledge that they're not going to win. They're very unlikely to win. So they know that. But uncertainty is when you've no idea about the probabilities that you face. And I think the government needs to give more clarity. There's a lot more information come out, especially in the United States, and the researchers there. There's a lot more information about the true level of risk that people face. And it's this, we can't not being complacent, but I think conveying this, and I think the message on sheltering has been mixed. First of all, it was advising over 70s, and now it's clear that if you're a healthy 70-year-old, your risk is much less than if you're a grossly obese 35-year-old. And I think it's that, to try and give people confidence and to emphasize more that certainly if you look at the London data, in terms of the admissions to hospitals are now down to almost a fifth of what they were at the peak. So in some parts of the country, the virus is dying out. So simply by conveying information, straight information about the true risks that people face, and that for most people, fortunately, they're very much less than we feared in the middle of March. And that's the thing I want to get across to people.
I don't like missing people out if they do ask a relevant question, especially when Tony Lloyd asks a question as well. So I'm going to come to Tony in a second. Hope Tony's feeling better as well. Being asked a question here from Kashif Javid. How does Paul see an impact on the service industry, and what measures are being taken to support the businesses, or rather, what measures should be taken by the businesses to be on the recovery track? Very interesting subject. The service industry has been really badly hit. So what measures should they be taking?
Well, I mean, the service, especially as we know, we see the impact in the town centre with that was starting to develop, if you like, with restaurants and bars, and the offer that was being developed, that was starting to develop, a real buzz rather than seeming like a complete morgue at 6:30 at night. Something was going on there. And so I think it's right and proper, because they've been forced to close down for reasons completely out of their control, so they should continue to be supported. And this is something we're actually actively looking at in the ODA. I can't go into the details, but this is a priority for the ODA to consider whether there's anything more specific. There's no guarantee, but we're thinking, is there something more specific we can do to assist these types of businesses? But again, people adapt. I mean, it's not the same thing, but increasingly, as you know, as people know, say, restaurants are offering takeaway services, more and more are doing this. And it does make it more difficult. And these will be, in fact, guided by the epidemiology evidence. These will be the last ones to get back to full capacity. But that's just, how things are. And I think it's good that the Chancellor has continued the furlough scheme because it gives more time perhaps for a treatment to emerge, but also more time for businesses to work out how to adapt and what sort of things they can be offering.
Final question. It's actually the first we were asked actually by Tony Lloyd. Interested to know whether Paul thinks it's credible to manage the economic movement from lockdown, getting the economy back on its feet while moving decisively, as we must be the low carbon economy of the future. What is the role of central and local government in this? So a couple of questions wrapped up into one there. What would your answer be, Paul?
Well, again, I think, Tony, this is another example of how a crisis provides an opportunity. Now, obviously people want traffic to get back moving. They don't want to see town centres and city centres, completely free of traffic. But it's given a big boost to people's perception, and it creates, if you like, a platform for people would be more receptive to low carbon technology. And I think this is certainly something. This is where the public sector has to take a lead in developing a framework and supporting this move I think this could be a very important part of the framework for leading out of the recovery. And it's one thing, for example, that our excellent, further education college, I've not mentioned this, but I'm very impressed. They've already got 100%, apart from haircuts, where you've actually got to do it physically. They've noticed mine. You see, I got mine with lockdown haircuts. Yes, but they've got 100% of their courses online. Technology, maybe they could start offering courses in how to install low carbon technology. I mean, if you're going to do it online, you don't need to, you could get experts from anywhere to do it for you, offer courses that way. So I think it's a big opportunity. I think Tony's correct to highlight this, and that people were more receptive. And it's one way in which we can look forward positively to the recovery.
Well, what I'm delighted by, our last Ambassadors event got curtailed at the end when one of the speaker's dogs, not going to mention Dave Brereton's name, started to bark. Thankfully, that's not happened in this case. So massive thanks to you, Paul Ormond, for giving up your time as well, answering so many questions, to Paul Dixon and also to Steve Rumblow, who do a magnificent job as well. And behind the scenes, there's always somebody pulling the strings. In this case, it's Alison Salas. I mean, we had 188 people at one stage watching. We've still got to nearly 150 now. So thanks very much for your time today, Paul. I wish you all the best in your new role as well. Thank you very much for everyone logging in today. Stay safe and stay alert. Of course, that's the new message. Thank you very much.
Thanks.